There are places in every town, city, and country in the world that nobody visits anymore. They used to be busy and full of life, but the people who used to go there have either passed away or moved on. Over time, these abandoned places take on an air of mystery as people forgot their original story. Let's lift the lid on a few of those mysteries in this video and check out some weird and wonderful abandoned places. Everybody knows about the enormous statue of Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Far fewer people know of the Christ of the Abyss statue in San Frutuoso, Italy. But there's a good reason for that. It's because the entire monument is underwater. Artist Guido Galletti made the bronze sculpture in 1954. While it might be a likeness of Jesus Christ, it was actually intended to be a tribute to Dario Gonzat, an Italian scuba diving pioneer. Why the artist chose to use Jesus rather than Gonzat himself is a question that doesn't have an answer. Galletti's work was installed just over 50 feet below the water's surface in August 1954 and remains there to this day, existing mostly in isolation but occasionally visited by a few curious divers. Seeing the statue with your own eyes obviously isn't easy, but if you want to get an idea of what it looks like without getting wet, you'll find a clay copy of it standing in the Italian National Museum of Underwater Activities in Ravenna. An umbrella and a raincoat might not be enough to protect you from everything that falls out of the sky on stormy days in Bangkok, Thailand. You also need to be cautious of debris falling from the abandoned, unfinished skyscraper known as the Sathorn Unique, also known as the Sathorn Ghost Tower. Construction work on the White Elephant began in the mid-1990s as Thailand experienced an economic boom, leading the country's architects to dream of Bangkok becoming a modern skyscraper city like New York. Unfortunately, the boom was built on bad investments and poorly thought-out deals. The boom quickly collapsed and became a deep recession, one that history now records as the Asian financial crisis of 1997. The country's economy contracted by 10% in a single year, bringing a sudden halt to construction work and causing the Sathorn Unique to be abandoned in a state of near completion. While other skyscrapers that were abandoned at the same time went on to be finished eventually, the Sathorn never was. It's now too late to save the building. It's become rickety and dangerous and will eventually have to be demolished. Villa Epen was once a picturesque Argentinian village in the Carhu district of the country. Now, it's a strange, washed-out set of forgotten ruins. Back in the 1920s, this was a tourism hotspot, with thousands of visitors drawn to Villa Epen every year by the stunning scenery and the salt lake. Some even said that the salty water had healing qualities, which led people with a variety of medical ailments to bathe in Lago Epen and float on its surface, hoping to be cured of their ills. The end of its time as a vacation destination came without warning in 1985. A freak weather pattern generated a standing wave in the lake, which broke through a dam and then plowed through the village. The whole settlement was left submerged in over 30 feet of briny water. It wasn't until 2009 that the water subsided enough for the ruins of the village to be seen again, at which point it immediately became obvious that the damage is beyond repair. The whole landscape is now eerie and white, with even the trees bleached by the salty tide. In the year 2000, an Italian entrepreneur had the strange idea of connecting two abandoned planes together at the nose and turning them into a unique restaurant. The one-of-a-kind eatery in Villa Marzana was named Michelangelo Da Vinci, on account of the fact that owner Gigi Stecca outfitted the two planes, a Tupolev TC-134A and a Douglas DC-6, with replicas of the most famous works by both artists. Stecca's vision came from his belief that every Italian dreamed of setting foot aboard an aircraft. What he'd failed to take into account is that, by and large, those dreams involved the planes flying into the air. For a short while, Michelangelo Da Vinci was successful, Reviewers spoke positively of the enormous pizzas, range of craft beers, and fish specials. Unfortunately, Stecca had played a little fast and loose with building and planning regulations when putting the restaurant together. Disputes over zoning violations eventually led to the restaurant shutting down in 2014 on what was initially said to be a temporary basis, but it never reopened. Now, several years on, the planes have been battered by the elements, and the replica art exhibition inside them is gathering dust. We're sure that Gigi Stecca took some comfort from the fact that his restaurant stayed open for a while. Igloo City in Cantwell, Alaska never opened at all. The merits of building a 4-story igloo-shaped hotel out of concrete always looked dubious, and the near-finished product isn't particularly attractive. This is another example of somebody starting building work without seeking the proper permissions. The hotel wasn't able to meet building code requirements even in the relatively more relaxed days of the 1970s, and so was doomed to failure without welcoming a single guest. Enormous amounts of money were spent in Igloo City, which is so large that it can be seen by planes flying overhead at heights of 30,000 feet. But little was recouped when its original owner sold it. It's changed hands several times since then, each time for less money, but its current ownership situation is unclear. As the doors are no longer padlocked and passers-by can get inside and take a look, we now know that the interior is mostly empty and badly vandalized. It probably doesn't have a future, but right now, its main purpose is to serve as a landmark indicating the halfway point between Anchorage and Fairbanks. Kalavantan Durg in Santoli, India, was designed to function as a fortress and a lookout post. It's perfectly positioned to serve such a purpose, but getting to it is a little difficult. In fact, the path to the top is so perilous that it's become known as the most dangerous fortress in the world. The fortress itself is little more than a cave carved into the top of a 2,300-foot-tall stone spire, but the twisting procession of thousands of hand-cut steps leading to it is an astonishing feat of engineering when you consider that they were carved more than 2,500 years ago. The staircase has been known as the Climb to Heaven. It's an obvious reference to the height of the fortress, but it could literally send you to heaven if you make one wrong turn during your ascent. The origins of the name Kalavantan Durg are unknown. Local folklore says that it was named after an ancient princess, but there's no historical or archaeological evidence to support that idea. It's been centuries since the fortress served any kind of military purpose, but that doesn't stop hundreds of tourists from risking their lives visiting it every year. The wreck of the Pegasus at McMurdo Station in Antarctica looks so pristine that you could easily believe it crashed there yesterday. But it actually crashed several decades ago. The ice and snow have proved to be the perfect preservative for its steel skeleton. It was October 8, 1970, when the Lockheed C-121 aircraft got into trouble trying to land at the base during an Antarctic storm. Visibility was down to almost zero, and the plane was running out of fuel. Before it even approached the runway, a violent blast of wind ripped away parts of its outer shell. It was a miracle that the pilot was able to execute anything like a normal landing, but on contact, the Pegasus skidded across the frozen runway before coming to a thudding halt in a wall of snow. Somehow, none of the 80 people aboard the plane were seriously hurt. The plane couldn't be salvaged, and having it removed was deemed a pointless expense, so it stayed where it is for more than 50 years. The wreck is now a landmark for other planes approaching the station, and the whole airfield is now known as Pegasus Field. Edward Dallengrige was born as the son of a baron in 14th century England. As he was the youngest son of the family, he didn't stand in line to inherit any of his father's wealth. That didn't sit well with young Edward, who broke off from his family and forged a career as a violent but successful mercenary in continental Europe. He eventually returned to the country of his birth with all his accumulated wealth in 1377 and built Beaulieu Castle in East Sussex. The beautiful Plantagenet castle and its moat caught the eye of King Richard III, who marked it as a possible line of defense in the event of England being invaded by the French. That invasion never came, but the castle turned out to be useful when the aristocracy had to hide inside it from the angry and violent poor during a working-class uprising in 1381. The castle is still standing today more than 600 years later, and externally, it's just as stunning as it was when it was brand new. The interior is a different story, though, and so only a few of its internal rooms are available for the public to view on guided tours. The rest is crumbling away in a state of permanent abandonment. If you translate the Portuguese name Marfim into English, you get Endless Sea, which is an appropriate name for this sunken Brazilian yacht. It sank into the water, and it came very close to never making it out again. The vessel was carrying a film crew shooting a documentary about Antarctica at the time of its sinking at Ardley Cove in 2012, but got trapped in floating ice and couldn't be moved. The crew was rescued by a Chilean ship that luckily happened to be passing at the time, but there was no way of retrieving the Marfim. Water flooded the stricken vessel's hull and then froze, splitting the ship open. Salvage teams spent a full year planning a refloating operation and eventually managed to raise her back up using a complicated system of buoys. But as soon as she came back to the surface, it was immediately apparent that the damage incurred during her sinking was too great for her to be repaired. She's since been scrapped, triggering an insurance payout of $700,000. Once upon a time, there were dozens of rusting abandoned cars parked in a forest close to Châtillon in Belgium. There are still a few of them there today, but there's barely anything left of them. Nobody's really sure who put the unwanted car fleet there or why, but there are a few versions of the tale told by local residents. The most popular of them is that all the cars were bought by American soldiers who were stationed in Châtillon during the Second World War. The cars were bought cheaply and would have been expensive to export back to America when the war ended, and the surviving soldiers returned home. Faced with bills they couldn't pay, the troops drove the cars into the woods, parked them up, and then walked away. Perhaps it's more likely that they were abandoned when an old car dealership closed down in the 1960s, but as there's no proof either way, we'll choose to believe the story about the American soldiers. It took more than 60 years for the local authorities to begin dismantling and scrapping the cars, and they still haven't quite finished. In the late 1920s, the Laale Theater in Chicago, Illinois, USA, was the place to be for local people in search of entertainment. The beautiful, iconic building ran a regular schedule of boxing every Tuesday and Wednesday, chorus girls on Fridays, and a combination of silent movies and vaudeville shows over the weekend. The theater's designers thought of everything. They painted tiny stars on the ceiling to imitate the sky at night, and packed a whole 2,200 seats inside. That was huge for the era. Things began to change during the 1930s when the Chicago mob bought out the theater. Frank Nitti still opened it to the public as a theater occasionally, but mostly used it for various shady private gatherings. By the end of the Second World War, the neighborhood had become run down, and the theater started to head the same way. It clung on until the early 1960s, but a local gangster was shot on its staircase in 1961, and it finally closed its doors in 1964. After that, it found a second lease of life as a church, but closed again shortly after the turn of the century, and has stood empty ever since. Both internally and externally, it's a pale shadow of its former self. North Brother Island in New York City is uninhabited now. It was uninhabited prior to 1885, too. But its brief period of human occupation is mired in controversy and sadness. The island was purchased by the authorities of the city of New York that year so they could build Riverside Hospital on it. thus giving themselves somewhere to send people with contagious diseases away from the rest of the city's rapidly growing population. You might have heard of Riverside's most famous patient. She was Mary Milan, who went on to become known as Typhoid Mary. She was quarantined here from 1907 to 1910, and then again from 1915 until she passed away in 1938. The questionable treatment of patients at Riverside Hospital isn't the worst thing that happened on North Brother Island, though. That unwanted mark of distinction goes to the General Slocum steamship disaster of 1905. The enormous vessel had over 1,000 people aboard when it caught fire close to the island in 1905. The burning ship came to the island for help, but only 321 passengers could be saved. Medical centers and rehabilitation clinics continued to operate on the island in relative seclusion until 1963, when the last such facility closed its doors for the last time. North Brother Island has been officially off-limits to the public ever since then, as if there's something there that the authorities don't want us to see. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!